Woo, now we got it on good and loud here. Good morning. Welcome to this panel on fragile states. I'm Jim Colby. I'm a member of the SID board, and my purpose here is simply to introduce the topic and the moderator who will introduce the panel. I just rushed from here from a session that I was at with the European ambassador, the EU ambassador. We were talking about the forthcoming trade and investment partnership, TTIP, as it's called, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And I said I had to go off to moderate a panel on fragile states, and he said, I certainly hope you're not including any of the European states in that group there. I said, I don't think we have them yet into the into this panel discussion here, but who knows, maybe they will come up here. In any event, we're very pleased you're part of this session and of this entire conference, which I think has an outstanding program. I want to just mention a couple of things that are kind of related to this before I introduce our moderator, and that is that SID, the Society for International Development. We hope if you're not members, you will become a member, and certainly follow it on the Twitter and on its website page. But SID Washington has a number of work groups. In fact, we have 23 different work groups that focused on a whole variety of different topics and areas, including some that are related to this topic. We have one focused on security and development, another one on crisis, conflict and transition, and one on governance, corruption, and rule of law. And in fact, for that latter one, our co-chairs of that group are here today, Derek Brinkenhoff right here, and Tom Bridle over in the back. You may want to have some conversation with them, or hopefully we'll draw them into this discussion here today, and we really appreciate your being a part of this. These work groups convene 3 or 4 times a year for panel discussions and other events related to their topic. So if you have some interest in it, you might want to talk to them, or certainly, again, go to the website and sign up. We want you to become more involved in the work of SID. The topic for today is about fragile states. Why do they matter? What difference does it really make? A couple of years ago, the SID working group on this launched a report, which was done working with some of the people at CSIS. And I think the report, which you can also find on the website, is a very comprehensive report about failed states, what the problems are, how you can identify them, and the recommendations. I'm not going to go into all of that here today, except to say that I think, because the recommendations I think will probably come out during the discussion, but I think it was interesting that they identified 4 kind of core issues that fragile states typically confront. The first is demographic pressures, whether it's the population growth, the youth bulge, the competition for scarce resources, water or food, the inequality, a widening gap between the wealthier and the poorer people within states, and discrimination, particularly along ethnic and racial lines in countries. Third is a fragmented security apparatus. That is where you have Praetorian guards that might be loyal to the ruler of the country, but are not really independent and do not have the right kind of training, and they undermine the monopoly. They make the monopoly of the state by force. And fourth is the criminalization and delegitimization of the state, which would be anything from rigged elections, coups, corruption, underground economies. And I think that just wanted to point those 4 things out because I think it might be relevant to the discussion as we go through this. And now with that, let me just introduce our moderator, who really will introduce the panelists. And I know this is going to be a lively discussion, and I hope we get you all involved. You have the biographies in your programs for all these people, so I'm not going to say much about Melanie Greenberg, except that she is president and CEO of the Alliance for Peace Building, has been involved both in philanthropy and in academia for a long time, and international conflict resolution has really been her bag, so to speak, for a very long time, and has helped design and facilitate public peace processes in the Middle East, in Northern Ireland, and in the Caucasus. Caucasus, so there's nobody that's better equipped to be the chair of this group here today, the moderator for it. And with that, Melanie, I turn it over to you to introduce our panel and get us started. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. And it is a great pleasure to be here at the SID conference speaking about why fragile states matter. And you may wonder why the head of a peace-building organization is here leading a panel on fragile states at this premier development conference. And I thought it might be useful to give you a history of how this panel came together. And the driving force was, for all the reasons that Jim just mentioned, fragile states are too large a problem for any one sector. That Ken Menkhaus, a noted scholar in the conflict and development field, has said that fragile states are wicked problems. And this is not just Boston vernacular. It's a type of problem that is so complex that linear solutions can make the problem worse, not better. And that wicked problems need holistic, integrated approaches in order to make a difference, to change the environment. So we wanted to focus today on how different sectors come together to start thinking about fragile states. To give some context about why we're here and why they're so important, for all of those of you who've read the World Development Report, we know that 1.5 billion people live in conflict-affected and fragile states. In the very near future, 40% of overseas development assistance will be going to people in fragile states. No fragile state has reached a single Millennium Development Goal. And these states have been plagued by conflict. And often conflict is described as development in reverse. So it's almost impossible to do any kind of meaningful society building, state building, even humanitarian relief when it keeps being washed away by conflict. And yet these states present very difficult policy decisions for the United States. How do we balance security concerns with humanitarian concerns? How do we think about policy when we're looking at a 20 to 40-year window on change in many of these areas of the world? It's very hard to keep a sustained policy engagement for that long. How do we work with partners, both donors, but also on the ground? Institutions are very weak. It's often very hard to know who to deal with to make the most change, which are the best levers to push, how to deal with issues of corruption, of cross-border kinds of violence. So for all these reasons, as we were thinking about fragile states, we wanted to bring in panelists who had deep experience not only in US policy, but also on the ground in these areas of the world. And I'm absolutely delighted today to introduce this panel, and I'll give you a brief overview of each of our speakers. Their bios are in your packet, so you can get the full details of their impressive careers. We will speak for 5 to 8 minutes per panelist, and then open the floor for discussion, since really what we wanted today was to hear your perspective and to engage in a meaningful dialogue. So Joe Hewitt, immediately on my right, is a technical team leader at USAID in the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, where in his own practice, he blends peace building and conflict management with development. And he will help frame for us current US policy towards fragile states, and also introduce us to the idea of resilience. Randy Tiff, to Joe's right, is a senior advisor to World Vision and is one of Washington's top thinkers in fragility, peace building, and development. He worked for AID in Serbia and Romania and on the Hill, so he brings a varied policy perspective. And at World Vision, he was deeply engaged in the process leading up to the Busan High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness and the New Deal. And he'll talk about World Vision's innovative programs in fragile states and the ripple effects of aid and the importance of engaging with local communities in delivering aid. To Randy's right, we are honored to have Haruyuki Shimada, who is the country coordinator for Afghanistan with the Japan International Cooperation Agency. And previously, he was an economist at the World Bank, so we can welcome him as a Washington insider as well. He brings us the reflections of another major donor nation, and also the reality of administering aid programs in a fragile state, Afghanistan, with significant security challenges. And finally, Ambassador William Garvelink, who's currently a senior advisor for global strategy at the International Medical Corps. He had a very long and distinguished career at AID, where he established the Bureau for Food Security. He also served at the State Department at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, and from 2007 to 2010 served as U.S. Ambassador to the Democratic Republic of Congo. So he's really seen firsthand the challenges of working in a resource-rich but very fragile state with great potential, but equally great security, governance, and humanitarian challenges. So I look forward to our discussion and then to opening up the floor. So Joe, starting with you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Melanie. I'm really delighted to be here. I want to thank the Society for International Development for inviting me, and thank you, Melanie, and the Alliance for Peace Building. I think I'm going to start off, maybe it's appropriate that I start off, because I'm going to go back to fundamentals a little bit. When I was asked to join this panel and talk about why we should care about fragility, that seemed so easy to me that I had deluded myself into thinking it might be easy to talk about. But sometimes talking about the obvious things can be the most difficult. So let me go back to fundamentals. Why is it that fragile states matter? I think to answer that, it's important to talk a little bit about or remind ourselves what fragility is. You know, we're not talking about poverty. We're not talking about the absence of democratic institutions. We're not talking in particular necessarily about the absence of vibrant economies. Those things are important and they're part of the picture, but fragility really refers to something perhaps broader. And at least in terms of what our office does, the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation at USAID, we define it very specifically. We define it as the absence of legitimacy and effectiveness in the interactions between state and society. That's what fragility is. It's a two-dimensional term. It refers to the extent to which those interactions have deficits in legitimacy and have deficits in effectiveness. Legitimacy is the extent to which outcomes are fair, inclusive, responsive to the needs of all identity groups. Effectiveness is something different. It's the extent to which interactions produce public goods in reasonable ways, like education and security and a vibrant economy. That's fragility. Fragility is a characteristic of the relationship between state and society. How do we know it's important? We know it's important because it seems to be very closely related to vulnerability to major armed conflict. There are about 50 countries in the world today that are conflict affected. What percentage of those exhibit significant levels of fragility? If it were 50%, we'd maybe raise our eyebrows and say, wow, that's a pretty big overlap. If it were 60%, we'd say, oh, that's a little bit more significant. It's a majority of those countries. But the real answer, in fact, is about 90%. 90% of the conflict-affected countries in the world, according to the way that we measure fragility in our office, exhibit significant levels of fragility. That tells us that the relationship between state and society tells us a lot about conflict vulnerability. And to Melanie's point in the introduction, if we're interested in making development investments in those countries that are lasting, we have to pay attention to how our work is addressing state-society relations to tackle that fragility and reduce the risks of conflict. So I guess I would like to make just a couple of points then. First, I think that there's some consensus in the donor community about the importance of this. Melanie mentioned the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States. It embraces 5 peace-building and state-building goals, which are really at the heart of tackling fragility. And they're important. The importance of enhancing legitimate politics, security, justice, and jobs, and also increasing the effectiveness of states in raising revenue. These are all crucial peace-building and state-building goals, and they are at the heart of fragility, or tackling fragility. Another piece of consensus, and this comes from the WDR 2011 report, is that it's clearly understood now that the transformation from fragility out of that condition takes a long time. The average country, according to the research in the WDR, the average time is about 20 years, which means that tackling fragility is a long game. And speaking from as a representative of USAID, I recognize that often our horizon, because of the necessities of what donors and funders require of us, the time horizon is often a short horizon. And it really, I think, underscores the importance of changing our orientation about development goals. The emphasis with fragility really is looking towards the long-term investment and what it would look like to make improvements over a long period of time. So that consensus leads me, I think, to my final point. If tackling fragility is a long game, the challenge, the primary challenge for all of us who implement or design development programs is to figure out what progress looks like in the short term when you're engaged in a long-term game. How do we know we are making progress towards the distant horizon when we're asked to make short-term steps with our development projects? I think what that means is that we as a community need to make investments in our learning agenda. I think we need to make investments in better quality theories of change so that we are better at assessing the evidence in our programs, whether it's an education program, whether it's an economic growth program, in terms of how it's improving state-society relations in the context we're working. So I would end with that I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit maybe in the Q&A about what would be required of us to make these kinds of investments in a learning agenda that helps us understand how to make short-term improvements while we're playing a long-term game. Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Joe. And just to comment on that part of the New Deal, which you talked about, involves the countries themselves developing indicators for how they will move out of fragility. And watching that indicator process and how they think about learning has been one of the most fascinating parts, I think. So I hope we can talk more about that.
That's a great point.
Good. Thank you for that wonderful framing. Randy.
Thanks, Melanie, very much. So I will weave in some World Vision experience, as Melanie suggested, but I will mainly speak from the perspective of World Vision, an international Christian relief development and advocacy organization. We work in about 100 countries. Many of those are fragile states. We work as a partner with official donors, including USAID, with which we're very pleased, but we also work with other donors around the world, and we work with private funding. In fact, globally, about 75% of our resources are from private sources. And so what I'd like to do is share 10 ideas for addressing fragile states. I came up with a top 10 list, and I will have some things to wave around in just a moment, a la David Letterman. But I will go from 1 to 10 rather than 10 to 1, and I'll try and go through these quickly to leave plenty of time, but I will be a little more stuck to my notes as I go through it than I will be during the Q&A. So here we go. Number 1, nutrition outcomes have been remarkable in some fragile states, even self-described fragile states like Sierra Leone, and there has been some demonstration that investing in fragile states in these kinds of areas is quite useful and is not necessarily going to be set back by the insecurity in those countries. We've all heard, as we've talked about the post-MDGs, that one of the great achievements has been to reduce by half the number of children under 5 who die by preventable causes. And I think we have a real opportunity to look at fragile states as states and people and communities that can do. If it's worth also noting that undernutrition kills many more children than conflict actually does. So we ignore this reality that nutrition interventions have been shown to work at our children's peril and our peril. And so governments and donors really need to channel funds and efforts accordingly. Striving for peace is vital, but it shouldn't mean pooling resources into security and sidelining basic needs like nutrition. Number 2, fragile states are disempowered often, but they're not passive. The people and communities in fragile states are capable of mobilizing for positive, peaceful change. And this is what drives governments, in fact, or states to respond, to build capacity by providing services, respecting rights, and addressing injustice. I could give an example from World Vision's experience. We are engaged in a program that's scaling up globally called Citizen Voice in Action. It's basically a local level advocacy methodology that transforms the dialogue between communities and government in order to improve services like health and education. In fact, now I'll start waving things. Just a month or two ago, released a report about what we've achieved in Uganda working in health and education, where we have utilized this social accountability approach, which we call citizen voice in action, but other organizations have implemented as well. We have seen greater accountability, improved services in governments and schools, but all of this kind of initiated from communities that work in partnership with local governments. And what may surprise some people is that it's not just the Ugandas where a steady state is capable of achieving this kind of change, but there are also, I'm holding in my hand actually, 2 reports received yesterday, one from South Sudan, World Vision's office, reporting achievements through the Citizen Voice in Action program in 3 area development programs. And interestingly, all 3 of these clusters of communities prioritize different things. Health and education was one, rural water usage was the second one, and child protection was the third. And so I'm looking at a whole list of what appear to be modest achievements, but put together actually signal pretty remarkable achievements. And I'm looking at a similar report from World Vision Pakistan, listing 4 areas, including a little place called Abbottabad, which some of you might have heard of, where in just that community, based on one intervention, a citizen voice in action intervention, which involves town hall style meetings to bring communities together with government officials, scorecard approaches to monitoring progress, and so forth. 1,000 citizens registered to vote, 3/4 of which were women. Applications of more than 5,000 children to be registered, processed, and an administration decision to put up 200 market stalls for small enterprises in the center of the city. Again, very micro, but if you look at what comes up from that, it's remarkable, and it's happening in fragile states. Number 3, context analysis is a critical factor in planning assistance, and that's why the New Deal is so important, because it calls for all partners in the pilot countries of the New Deal to engage in a fragility analysis that is joint and ought to be, and if it's not, I think the donor countries ought to ask them to redo the fragility analysis. Your office, Joe, and the State Department Conflict and Stability Operations Bureau are critical because they also run something called the ICAF, the Integrated Conflict Assessment Framework, which is becoming more used as an interagency tool to really get the assessment right. And World Vision and other NGOs have similar parallel tools. Number 4, the operational approach in post-conflict states is a critical factor. Sorry, Melanie, I'm tied to my notes. Could you turn that back on for me? Oh, thank you. And so, if you take, for example, Somalia and the post-conflict situation there, it really is possible that donors like the US could default to a stabilization approach without looking carefully at the context, without asking the question of what parts of South Central Somalia, where al-Shabaab is now in retreat, may actually be more permissive than we think, than we first think, and might call for an approach which would not necessarily look like a stabilization approach, for example, development interventions with armed security, but may actually call for interventions that look very different and where a security or effectiveness approach is based on community acceptance. So the operational approach in post-conflict is critical. Number 5, resilience. It's a bridge, and it's a USAID's strategy is one we ought to strongly support because it has great promise to improve the way we address fragile states and to bridge humanitarian and development assistance, and I'll leave it there. Number 6, a little bit of an echo of what I just said, but state building can often be more effective bottom up than top down. And I would say that the governance of fragile states is more often strengthened by interventions that may actually start with communities. And communities that own the objectives of development assistance may actually achieve reform that gets scaled up and actually creates better ownership than if you try to achieve the same reform top-down. I can talk about Afghanistan maybe during the Q&A, where we might have some lessons to learn. Number 7, blending security and counterterrorism objectives with humanitarian and development assistance in fragile states is building a strong evidence base for failure. I would argue that we need to reassess what we're doing in countries like Mali, Niger, and all of West Africa, and consider even a reassessment of programs like the Trans-Sahel Counterterrorism Partnership. Some of you may have been involved there and can explain some of the good work achieved through that program, but I would argue that if you look at Mali, Niger, and the other countries today, there's a strong reason to reassess the way in which the US government delivers assistance to those kinds of contexts with a greater security lens and blending of funding streams and objectives than may be merited in that context. Number 8, encourage private development assistance. And I hope official donors will recognize and take seriously that a lot of assistance to fragile states is actually coming from private sector and from non-governmental organizations that deliver private development assistance. Number 9, relatedly, encourage, and this will be a little bit maybe off tone from some recent discussions about country ownership, but encourage the presence of Americans, including private donors, in the field. I think we need a balance of presence and resources, and I'll explain why in the Q&A. Number 10, promote civil society development and peace building. I just wanted to draw a line under that because this is a crucial moment of opportunity for civil society organizations. They are not passive or impotent, even in fragile states. The SID report that Jim mentioned has actually several good references to the Middle East, North Africa context and how civil society has played a crucial role. So I would say that we have great opportunities to promote civil society in fragile states where they may often lack legitimacy in the eyes of government as a representative voice, and that we ought to make that a top priority going forward in any fragile states policy or agenda. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Randy, and thank you for the emphasis on the bottom-up and civil society-oriented approach. That so often the conversation is between donors and governments, and especially when governance is so weak in these areas, there are great resources in that civil society space, even though it can be more complicated to access. So thank you. Yes, and Shimada-san, we'll look forward to hearing the view from Afghanistan.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Good morning, so I'm Shimada, so I came from Tokyo, and only 3-day trips, but anyway, it's my pleasure to be here. Yeah. And let me raise some points from my own experiences in Afghanistan and on Afghanistan in Tokyo. I'll raise 4 points, 3 points plus 1. Number 1, funding to Afghanistan over the past decade is not insufficient. Huge amount of money has been provided to the Afghanistan as aid. Let me give you one example. So last summer, 2012, in Tokyo, there was a big conference for Afghanistan. At the time, $16 billion was pledged by international community, $16 billion. It's a huge amount of money. However, the money has not been used efficiently, unfortunately. It is because responsibility of the Afghan side. I think you are familiar with the weak governance of the Afghan government. Corruption is most famous example. But I think donor community has also responsibility. For example, donor community has to spend much money for security. We have to protect ourselves by ourselves. That's why we have to spend much money for security. And another point, for example, so multi-layer contract structures. At the next room, so The session on this procurement is ongoing now. Procurement is very important issue to be discussed, but anyway, let me say at this moment, so for example, multi-layer contractor and subcontractor and the subcontractors, those kind of multi-layer contractor system is very costly. That is one of the, I can say, our responsibility. The point two, history tells us that external interventions to Afghanistan has never ever succeeded. You can see the example now, the British empires and the Russian empires. And they have had only short-term interest in Afghanistan, and they come quickly without realizing its reality, Afghan's reality, and leave promptly. It's very unfortunate history. And third point, anyway, we should realize the state or nation building is inefficient project. Inefficient means it's costly, need much money, and time consuming. Anyway, inefficient project. I think not huge money is required, but anyway, we need a long-term environment. That is important. I think some patience is anyway necessary for proceed such kind of project. And I come from Tokyo, so let me add another point from Japanese point of view. Japanese involvement to Afghanistan has been so much related to the US foreign policy. Fortunately and unfortunately, however, Japan cannot conduct military support to Afghanistan because of its constitutional restraints. I say it's sometimes binding of our activities. We cannot go to the remote area because of security. But sometimes it's an advantage of Japanese people. Okay, I'd like to raise those 4 points. Okay, thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Shimada-san. And it sounds like a theme is emerging of how to balance the long-term intervention and an inefficiency of the process with the need to measure short-term effectiveness in these contexts. So thank you very much for that perspective. And now, Bill, on to you.
Okay, I'll just make a couple of quick, brief comments. It's always kind of difficult being last. I've been making notes about what to talk about, and I can't read my notes. Just one observation early on. In our discussion so far, we've talked about development activities in fragile states, and most of what I'm going to say relates to my experience in the Congo for a few years. And we cannot forget the political angle of this. While we're all focused on stability and development, the political leaders in the Congo or Afghanistan or Somalia are focused on survival, political survival. And so we have two conflicting agendas that we have to figure out how to merge in a useful way. But most political leaders are in fragile states are focused on the conflict that's going on there, perhaps a little bit on humanitarian assistance, and that's about it. And when we come in and talk to them about long-term development, we got to understand the context in which we're doing it. It's a tough sell when you're perhaps your physical survival depends on how you deal with your conflict setting there. So that we've got to put that into context. And then just one more depressing observation, which I've been looking at for the past few months. Urbanization is underway in Africa and Asia at a pace faster than any other time in history. And urbanization is occurring primarily in Africa and fragile states, the countries least able to deal with what's going on. And so what you're seeing happen, according to studies I've read, is urbanization equates with slum creation in Africa. 70-some-odd% of the people who live in Africa's urban centers live in slums. So you have a malnourished population in general, a very young population, and an unemployed population in urban centers. When you have that kind of setup in rural areas, that's a horrible development problem and humanitarian problem. When you have it in a major urban center, it's an explosive political crisis. And that is coming in every fragile state, and half of them are in Africa. So that's something that the international community traditionally does not deal with. We have not really focused on urban issues. It's something we don't know a whole lot about, and I think it's something that we ignore at our peril. So just to throw that out, that things are going to get worse in fragile states, not better, if we don't do something about urbanization. A couple of comments on a track record. It has not been good and for the international community dealing with fragile states, and we've talked a bit about that. A third of all ODA, and probably more than that in the near future, goes to the fragile states. The majority of that assistance is humanitarian assistance, not development assistance. A few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, Bob Zellick, who's head of the World Bank, pointed out that fragile states aren't just a difficult development problem, they're a different problem that have to be dealt with differently. And I think the G7 plus would agree with that. And one way, well, if you look at, certainly from my experience in the Congo, what fragile states need quickly is they need a lot of jobs, and they need to begin providing social services to their population. And the studies that I've read show that if in places where that happens, violence decreases and institutional credibility increases. It's a long process, but it's a way to get it started. The organization or the part of the international community that can be most helpful in that is the private sector, in my view. They have, interestingly, the same objectives. They want to create jobs, and they want to see social services provided. What the private sector needs is a healthy and educated workforce, and it needs, as it develops its value chain in the country, reliable businesses. And by that, I mean small and medium-sized enterprises that have people trained technically and in managerial skills. And that's what the private sector needs to invest, not just in fragile states, but all states. And they're willing, as over time, we're seeing more and more investments in fragile states, not just by the extractive industries, but by all large corporations. And they're focused on medium and large enterprises, national ones, which are the largest generator of employment in the developing world. And so I think there's a synergy here if we do this right with the private sector, which has the long vision. It's always interesting when you work for the State Department, a long-term perspective is about 6 months, maybe a year. AID's long-term perspective is 5 years, but it's actually year to year because of the budget. And then you talk to companies, and it's 50 years or 75 years, and they're willing to put money into these companies. They're willing to put money into the health of their workers and their training of their workers so that they can develop their companies. And I think certainly in the case of fragile states where they need this quickly, if the U.S. government and other governments can help with some enabling environments and can work through this, there is a convergence of interests of the fragile states, of the donors, and the private sector community. Up till now, when certainly from my experience in AID, when you deal with the private sector, you're talking about corporate social responsibility. We welcome that, that's great, and it's peanuts compared to what these companies put into the countries where they have their businesses and where they're working. And if we work with the private sector at their core, it can be a long-term approach to address some of these issues that are fundamental to getting fragile states stabilized so you can actually begin a more elaborate development process. Thanks.
Good. Thank you very much, Bill. And perhaps in the Q&A we can talk about how the private sector thinks about conflict assessment, assessing risk, some of the things we've talked about on the non-private sector side. Is there a different calculus that business uses? So I would love to use my chair's prerogative to ask a first question, then to open up the floor, because I think we've had great food for thought. But I would love to ask all of you, we are at a very specific political moment right now, both in the New Deal for engagement in fragile states, which several of our panelists refer to, but also in the post-2015 process. The high-level panel report came out this week with a very strong emphasis on peace building and governance issues. And I would love to ask our panelists whether they are optimistic or pessimistic, or neither, on the New Deal and where the post-2015 agenda is going. we perhaps start with Joe and move down the line.
I am optimistic. I guess I'll talk a little bit about the New Deal. See if I can tell you why I'm optimistic. I guess I'd start first with something I said in my comments to begin with. I think the New Deal focuses on the right set of priorities. I am convinced that from a conflict perspective, and full disclosure, my main priority, or the main thing I think about most days, is conflict prevention, and conflict mitigation. And from my perspective, as I said, characteristics of the relationship between state and society play a crucial role in driving the conflict vulnerability of countries. And I think the New Deal focuses squarely on improving those relationships in ways that I think are likely to reduce the vulnerability of conflict in those societies. So, that said, the extent to which the New Deal is successful is the extent to which you'll see a reduction of conflict risk in those societies. The New Deal is really, it focuses on the partnership between the local country, the G7 plus country that has self-identified as fragile, and a country from the international community, a donor partner. And that partnership is going to culminate in a compact, to use the terminology from the New Deal, a compact about what kinds of goals both the donor country and the local country think are possible. And that compact, in turn, is based on a fragility assessment in the country, a country-led fragility assessment where the country itself determines what the main priorities are in terms of progressing out of fragility. That assessment needs to be done, obviously, in a candid way, in an open way, in a way that is accountable, lends itself to accountability. And so all of those, I recognize, are stiff challenges. And so to the extent that the partnership, both the G7 plus country and the donor country, can overcome a lot of those challenges, is really the main hurdle, I think, to progress. And so I would be cautiously optimistic. It depends on, the different partnerships are going differently. I was just in Kenya a couple weeks ago working with our Somali country team and paying close attention to the new partnership that's now going on between the EU and Somalia in connection with the New Deal, and got to see close up what some of those challenges look like. But I remain cautiously optimistic. I think this is exactly the kind of path that needs to be taken. And so with that, it's a process, and we're just going to move through that process.
Great, thank you. Randy?
Starting about 10 years ago, leadership from Japan especially promoted a human security agenda and the responsibility to protect, which was a very important agenda and got, I think, a lot of important initiatives rolling. Some might say, though, it's been hard to sustain that energy. And I think right now the New Deal is the best tool out there because of the consensus around it, because it was endorsed at Busan by 50 or 60 countries, including those countries that stepped up and said will be pilot countries, starting at the beginning 7 and now 8 with Somalia added. And so I think it is the best opportunity right now to get the right principles applied. One of those key principles is state-society relations must be energized behind both the fragility assessments and the compacts. One vision, one plan is the phrase that's used. And I think there's been a tension so far between, as there often is with any foreign policy initiative or foreign assistance initiative, between getting it right to produce some early results and more buy-in versus, getting it right takes time. And actually, I think you have to, but you're tempted to push it sooner before you get it completely right. And I think in this case, with the first few countries that have done fragility assessments, the involvement of civil society, the participation of grassroots people in those countries probably has not been what we hoped. And so that's the tension, but I still think that, and I just might add that there has been actually strong backing from a civil society platform for state building and peace building, which is a pretty remarkable group. It includes almost equal parts of northern NGO or civil society leaders and southern leaders, and it came together in a very, I would say, this is where the balance came again. They worked quickly, but they also got the representation right by having a fairly participatory process in every country to select representatives. And so you now have a group of about 15 civil society leaders recognized by their own governments and by the international bodies, the OECD's INCAF and the G7 plus countries, which are the two donor and partner country bodies that formally support the New Deal and are responsible to implement it, recognize that civil society group. So you've got actually a very strong and legitimate civil society voice. And one way we used that voice was actually to get Somalia, which wanted, even as a transitional government, wanted to be a pilot country. We pushed in the various Somalia donor meetings to get them that status, because we feel like to get Somalia right, we have a better chance through a New Deal lens and having that lens forced onto the table for everybody to consider than if it were not present.
I co-chair one of the working groups of that civil society organization, so I can speak to the daily conversations with our partners on the ground up to the global policy process. It's
Right.
very, very dynamic. Good. Thanks, Randy. Shimada-san?
Yes, of course, I'm optimist so about the New Deal. Fragile state, so I'm sure fragile is appropriate or not word anyway, so people say fragile state. And who judge this is fragile state and which is not, that is not fragile is another problem. Anyway, fragile state should go with international community. We should go with fragile state. And to tackle with this fragile problem, so we need to make approach, so comprehensive approach, diplomacy, sometimes military, and sometimes the politics, economics. It's okay, so I'm optimistic. I'm supporting it. However, from a point of view, my experience, again, Afghanistan, sometimes I feel, I have to be sometimes pessimism, yeah, because over the past decades, so in Afghanistan, United Nations and the countries, of course, United States has made approach, a comprehensive approach. However, so you can see the reality of today's Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is going to face the presidential election next year, and most of the foreign troops will be withdrawing and the next year. So everybody is uncertain what will going to happen after the next year. And I want to be optimist, but I cannot now. That's my feeling.
Well, thank you for that healthy dose of pessimism as well. Good. Bill?
Well, I guess I'm a little more of a killjoy on this. I think, first of all, it's important that Fragile States now is on the stage and it's on the agenda like it never has before. And that's an important, you have to begin the discussion and begin to deal with Minkhouse's wicked problem, because it is. But I think to make this work, you need sustained political commitment from leaders of fragile states, which is going to be a very hard thing to do. You need sustained commitment from the U.S. government and the Japanese government, a very hard thing to do. We have a short time span here and seem to be able to focus on 2 or 3 issues at a time, and that's about it. Resources, unless you focus really heavily in the private sector, are declining. It'll be interesting to see if the donor governments accept the metrics that are put together by fragile states. We don't accept our own quite often. And we work on one plan and one design for development. Well, we can't do that in the United States. It's a little presumptuous to assume that the fragile states, who are under much more difficult circumstances, can do this. So I really do hope it works, but there are some very difficult problems that have to be tackled in a very direct and sustained way. And I think the developed countries, you almost have to approach this with the idea of a special envoy type status. We have got to focus on this every day with the fragile states, or it's just not going to work. It's too hard, and there are too many other competing issues, not only for developed countries, but for the fragile states themselves. So I hope so.
Good. A wonderful idea about the special envoy model. So I'd like to open the floor now. We have microphones on either side. I'm sorry to be so formal, but I think for us to hear, we should do that. Why don't we cluster our question in twos? So, sir, why don't you go first?
Sure. My name is Tom Bridle. As Jim mentioned, I'm co-chair with Derek of the SID work group on governance, and I'm really happy to hear the emphasis here on the metrics around this, measuring what fragility means, measuring impact of programs. I think it's incredibly valuable, and the work group has been focused around that this year with a series of panels, and I hope that one of those can focus on impact evaluation in fragile states, because I think it's a critical, important question. But I really actually wanted to address a question to Mr. Tift. As you mentioned, World Vision is a Christian organization based very strongly in Christian values. And I really wanted to see if you could help me better understand how those values and the nature of the organization expresses itself on the ground in fragile states, in post-conflict situations, and in particular in places like Pakistan, for example, which are majority Muslim countries where World Vision had a program until 2009 when USAID shut it down, and in places like Uganda, Ethiopia, where one of the significant human rights issues are the rights of gays and lesbian groups. And I wonder if those voices and those groups would be included in some of the ground-up, grassroots sorts of agenda processes that Mr. Tift mentioned.
Good. Thank you. Sir?
Benny Lowe with ICF International. This is a question I suppose to Mr. Ambassador, but really it'd be interesting to hear everyone else's thoughts on this, specifically speaking in reference to Sub-Saharan Africa, Congo, Uganda, et cetera, and conflict minerals and the like. I was wondering if you could speak generally to the role that state donors play and also private sector play in de-risking a lot of these environments and working at the issue of rent-seeking behavior on behalf of these governmental leaders. So to de-risk and incentivize foreign investment to these fragile states, one. And two, to ensure that the transparency mechanisms and such are in place such that prolonged investment continues in these states. And that, the attention is there throughout. Speaking in reference specifically to provisions in Dodd-Frank, there we go. Sections 1502 and 1504 in Dodd-Frank, specifically international transparency provisions and the like. I was wondering if you folks could speak a bit toward the role of state donors and private sector in that balance. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. So, Randy, you'd like to take the first question, then we'll open it up to this question of rent-seeking and transparency.
Thanks. Thanks for the question. So, World Vision is a Christian organization, and we are clear with our partners in any country about the motivation for what we do, why we serve, sometimes sacrificially, in places where our staff face dangerous circumstances or work for very little pay. And that's motivated by God's love for them and their basic human dignity, granted by God in our view. But we also don't, of course, impose any particular religious view on anybody, and that's the Red Cross Code of Conduct. I mean, that's 101, and that's something we've always adhered to and would not ever consider otherwise. So the question, I think you mentioned two Muslim contexts, Pakistan and Somalia? Was it Somalia? Both are interesting because we have, at least in Pakistan and other majority Muslim contexts, there are, of course, church groups in some contexts which are very supportive of programs when, for example, 12 or 15 years ago, we, World Vision globally, got very deeply involved in the HIV/AIDS issue. And just before President Bush's PEPFAR initiative, actually, we started to mobilize faith groups, church groups in particular, to become caregivers, to support prevention activities, and to mobilize churches and volunteers within those churches to go out in massive numbers, tens of thousands, to be trained appropriately to play that role. And what we learned very quickly is that the imams in a country that might have significant Christian and Muslim adherents were just as interested and many times wanted that same training. And we have actually mobilized programs on HIV/AIDS response, which we call Channels of Hope. It's a large-scale training and equipping program. Now works almost equally with mosques and with churches in these countries. And there was a very interesting situation over the past year in Ghana. Some of you may have heard of a video which is based on a story about the friendship of a Nigerian imam and a Nigerian pastor, Christian pastor, and it's been U.S. Institute of Peace and others have promoted this very strongly, even in overseas context, as a peace-building tool. There was a moment in Ghana, even in Ghana, where there seemed to be some tensions around an election that could spill into sectarian violence. With a very small, relatively small investment, we stepped forward and managed to get a translated version of that imam and pastor video and get it on national television, and it had a remarkable impact on the tension that was rising in Ghana at that time. Somalia, our staff who worked there over the last 10 years would tell you that the relationships with the local Muslim leaders is what enabled us to work as effectively as we did. The acceptance of other people of the book was actually just as strong, and it may be even stronger, in fact, than some of the secular peer agencies that were working in other parts of southern Somalia. So it's interesting that you can actually have a deeper respect in some ways as a faith organization, plus you have the chance to mobilize local faith communities to implement some of the important work in ways when sometimes they can be more effective. On the Uganda case, I don't know a lot, except that I know World Vision played a role in Uganda in bringing sides together when there was a lot of tension over a law related to homosexuals and their rights. And so I know that some of our local staff brought church leaders and others together to try and diffuse some of that tension, and I think actually helped a little bit. And so that's our perspective. Thanks.
Good. Thanks, Randy. And who would like to start now this question about de-risking?
Well, what the heck?
Okay, jump in.
Just a couple of comments about the role of the private sector and more broadly. It's a two-edged sword. The private sector can be a very positive force when it's working in fragile states, and it can be a very negative one. And if, in my sense, and again, I'm going to relating this primarily to my experience in the Congo, despite all the difficulties going on in the Congo, there was a lot of private investment going on there, and not just the extractive industries led by Freeport-McMoRan, but a lot of agricultural companies that were engaged there. And the ones that work very closely with the embassy and the commercial and economic section there, and with the aid mission as to who the good guys are, who are the bad guys, who you want to work with, who you don't want to work with. You can maneuver through a very difficult system that exists in the Congo and get businesses going, and in a very legitimate way. And as they do this, it's interesting to watch the various ministries that are engaged eyeing a transparent process and seeing how that works. And if it's done right, and if it's done in a very transparent way, and it's done in cooperation with a lot of other players like the embassy and the Department of Commerce back here for U.S. companies, you can have a rather significant impact on the sitting government and a lot of government officials, and make headway that opens up the environment and makes it much more welcoming to the private sector. So I think there's a way to do it. It just has to be done carefully, and not, this is one of the dilemmas that I kind of marvel at when you're talking about fragile states. There's a lot of corruption in fragile states. It's pervasive. That's one of the characteristics. And if you're going to try and promote private investment, development in those countries, you're going to have to tolerate a fair amount of corruption. You can't go after everything. You can't do it all. You have to focus. And I think while some of us in this room may be willing to do that, inspector generals and members of Congress aren't very likely to be as sympathetic to that process. And so it's a difficult choice to make, but you've got to pick and choose your focus when you're dealing with corruption and zero in on some of the worst problems, and others you save till another day. And I think if you take a very strategic approach, the role of private sector in fragile states, you will have a lot more resources at your disposal to work with the folks who are unemployed. There'll be a lot of jobs training. There are examples where in the private sector in the Congo, the U.S. private sector took over the health care for the families that work for them. And then it expanded from there. There are a whole bunch of things that have gone on in the middle of a fragile state that you never think would work. And the Congo is sort of your ultimate fragile state. And things do work there if you go about it very carefully in a very targeted way.
Thank you. Joe, how about a government perspective on this?
And I was sitting quietly hoping Ambassador Garvelink would weigh in first, because anybody who knows something about the Congo knows something about this issue. I guess I have maybe two observations to make, and I don't know if this is going to be hugely helpful or maybe not even hugely insightful, but certainly number one, our office has been thinking more and more about the relationship between conflict dynamics and the criminalization that goes on around extractive industries. When insurgencies need to raise resources and there is the potential to raise resources from valuable minerals, the extraction of valuable minerals, the incentives are there for the criminalization around that industry. But what we don't really fully understand are what kinds of programming, call it peace building or conflict mitigation programming, can be designed to program against that dynamic. And this is an area where we really want to learn more as an office to try to be more effective programming in that space. So that's one observation. A second observation, I've been struck recently with so much really interesting creative work making use of information technologies as a way to shine light on government institutions to help to incentivize transparent and uncorrupt behavior, as a way to incentivize more sort of transparent, accountable behavior. And I really look to that as an area where we're perhaps going to see a lot of progress, at least on the government side. The really creative use of technologies to get information out to people about what leaders, maybe democratically elected leaders, are doing with respect to these industries. And I think that's going to help push things in the right direction as well.
Thank you. Would either of you like to address this question?
Okay.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you. So who is next in line on this side? Yes, good. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Kevin Melton with AECOM. I actually spent 3 years out in Afghanistan working at the tactical, the operational, the strategic levels. And so this question is a little bit geared towards Mr. Ambassador. What you said, it's not maybe towards you, but you did say that in order for us to address issues in fragile states, we have to do it carefully and in a targeted way. And I think we've talked a little bit about that this morning. Apologies for being late. But one of the things I'd like to talk about is the plague of the international community being its own worst enemy. And that is the failure to coordinate. The failure to actually address that gap between humanitarian assistance and traditional development that all fragile states lie in. And so when I used to refer to this with my own leadership, I used to call it the stability continuum. We've used this word stabilization over and over again. Yet, I can't go to one single department inside our own government to give me a common definition. And so I wonder what coordination we have both in the international community that we can do better, maybe from your own experiences, but also within our own government, and what interagency will mean to that coordination in the future so that we can address these problems better.
Great, thank you. Why don't we just take a bunch of questions, then we'll move down our panel, because we've only got about 5 to 7 minutes left. So on this side.
Hello, my name is Ibrahim Beg. I work with Humanity in Action out of New New York. I have a quick question about, specifically about the Pashtun region in Pakistan. I was recently in Abbottabad, and from there I traveled via car up into the mountains of Muzaffarabad, came all the way down, trekked it all the way across Islamabad to the Pashtun region, and the difference was just enormous. You go up towards Muzaffarabad, where the quake hit in 2005, and amazingly, these people are building their lives again. There is economic and social development there. The only uncomfortable thing about that region is, quite frankly, the Pakistani intelligence presence and the military presence over there. But you go across Pakistan, which I just did a few weeks ago in Peshawar, and the situation is completely different. The security situation is so bad that no one actually leaves their homes. I have family members all across the entire region that I speak to, and quite frankly, no one's even sending their young children to school anymore. When I was there, suicide attack. When I left, a female principal was shot going to school. The situation is so different from one place to another in that same country. And we're talking about economic and social development and the New Deal, but on the ground, the situation is very different. How do you actually expect to make a difference in the Pashtun region? And I'm not worried about the Hazara region of Pakistan, not the Punjab region, but specifically the Pashtun region where it's so bad. I hate to be pessimistic here, but when you are close to so many suicide attacks, every time I've visited that country, my goodness, I mean, there's always been an attack nearby. So I'm just wondering, how in the world can you expect to spur economic, social development, security situation over there is so bad?
Great. Thank you. Is there one more on this side here?
Yeah, hi, my name is Rick O'Sullivan. I'm the chair of the Civil Society Work Group at SID Washington, and took a little umbrage in the fact that we were not mentioned as part of the solution in dealing with fragile, dysfunctional states. Where the government is dysfunctional, why aren't we turning to civil society more? When we reduce it, as we usually do, to advocating for change in government or as a watchdog for over government activities, that's a good way to get yourself killed in a fragile state. But rather, I heard some tantalizing points about looking at local initiatives where the civil society can serve as an alternative to government, in addressing the issue of transparency, not just in terms of the private sector, but in terms of transparent governance and delivery of social services, where civil society plays a much more effective role than either the government or private sector. It tends to be utterly underutilized. And could you speak to how that could work in the future?
Great. Thank you. On this side, Paul?
Thanks. Thanks, Melanie, and all the panelists. Paul Miller, Catholic Relief Services, great panel. You keep talking about fragile states like they're floating above the world, not connected to other countries. So in the illustrative goal of the post-2015 high-level panel, they talk about trying to de-stress fragile states in terms of international issues. Extractives goes across borders, arms go across borders, human trafficking goes across borders. So there's a bunch of different areas that really affect the fragile states and whether they become less fragile. So your comments on that, and corruption, of course, also goes across borders. I was going to address you, Bill, as Ambassador Killjoy. You said something actually pretty positive, so let me try again. Ambassador, how do we get American civil society or other elements here in the United States to have a lobby for special envoys to work on programs over 10 or 15 years to make sure that U.S. foreign policy keeps these issues present? The diaspora is fractious. The advocacy organizations are starstruck. What do you propose? What can help?
Great. Thanks, Paul. So why don't we have these two questions, and then we'll run down, and everybody can choose the one that he or she wants to close with. Sir?
In either sequence, I just wanted a little clarification on two provocative points I heard. One, why do we need more foreigners staffing efforts in fragile countries? I gather there were some reasons. And on the question, there's no question that the development challenges are now in the cities. Whether the political challenges are there, are you suggesting that Mao Zedong's strategy for overthrowing a revolution is now dated?
Good. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lynn Carter. I'm with Management Systems International, and I have both a question and a comment. The question is what new threats you see to fragility. Ambassador Garvelink mentioned rapid urbanization as one, and certainly Karachi, with its changing ethnic mix due to the influx of Pashtuns, is an example of a very destabilized and violent environment. Another area that I've not heard mentioned is rising organized crime and the penetration of drug money into politics in Kenya, Guinea-Bissau, Honduras, name the countries, and the decimation of communities due to the leakage of drugs locally, even if they're trying to move, even if it's on the route somewhere else. And then a comment about the need for more robust monitoring and for shorter-term measures of progress. I think there's an equal need for highly differentiated and very localized data as well. There's a tendency to want to focus on highly aggregate indices and dashboards that obscure and confuse more than they enlighten, and particularly if we're trying to talk about programming, I think in very diverse environments like Afghanistan, like Pakistan, you really need to know localized environments. USAID through MSI is funding the largest sample survey ever done in Afghanistan, a sample of 35,000. We're taking those data and other data, running them through high-speed computers at Yale. It takes 10 days to run the data, even through these computers. But we're beginning to be able to say that in this microenvironment, you should be doing this kind of programming and not that kind of programming. And we're also beginning to be able to predict violence out 5 months and getting close to being able to say that within a 9-month period, you'll see an uptick in IEDs, you'll see an uptick in violence. So more differentiated data would allow you to do more with programming. That said, it's an expensive endeavor, and where does the money come from in environments where you're not quite so flushly funded? Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we have 6 questions relating from failure to coordinate, reach differences even within one country, civil society and its role, regional approaches, data approaches, and political challenges. So why don't we move from Bill and move this way this time, just your final remarks.
Yeah, now.
Yes.
It's a comment on special envoys. I just made that up. But the more as I was thinking about it, it's an interesting observation. The State Department and the United Nations, when there is a particular issue, will assign someone to focus on that full time. And I think that may not be a bad thing for development agencies to do as well. I mean, there's a whole range of issues we're engaged in, and fragile states happens to be one of them, but it's a kind of an important thing, so why not devote full-time attention of a small number of people? I remember in the Congo at one point, and it did help for a while, is we had a US envoy, an EU envoy, and someone from the UK, and they worked as a team and traveled around the capitals and spent a lot of time in Kinshasa, and they got a lot of attention and people listened. And it seems to me that is something that we ought to try if we're serious about dealing with fragile states. It's a complicated problem, and fragile states need a lot of help, and we need to understand a lot better what's going on in the dynamics. So you can't do this a couple hours every week and then hope something's going to change. We need full-time attention, and that's the major donors, and that's the United Nations. And I don't recall that we've tried that in recent years, and it might be something useful to raise. It's a priority for the U.S. government. You ought to push them to make it a real priority, sort of put their people where their mouth is, in a sense. Just an observation on coordination. I wish I had something useful to say. I think perhaps quite often we see coordination as a solution to things, and it's not necessarily a solution. And sometimes I fear we coordinate a little too much. But it's a tough, there are so many different actors with so many different priorities and so many different mandates that, everybody says we want to be singing from the same sheet of music. I think if we can sing from the same Psalter hymnal, we're probably closer than, or about as close as we're going to get.
Thank you. Shimada-san?
Which question?
You can choose any or none.
Okay. So comprehensively, so private, the civil society and the coordination. So I'm coming from the public sector, the agency of the Japanese government. With supporting the many countries, fragile and failed and developing countries. But we cannot do anything without support from the civil society. Of course, the private sector, that is the reality. But some kind of coordination. Of course, coordination among the donor community is necessary. Plus, we need to coordinate with private sector, civil society is also necessary, a must. But it's very takes time and it takes costly. But somebody has to do it. And who should be responsible for it? I'm sure, I have no idea now, but somebody has to do it, and it should be done by somebody. So coordination needs another coordination, but we need coordination. Thank you.
Thank you. Andy?
So let me try to address the two questions together. One about why not civil society alternatives, that is civil society as service providers, as an alternative to government, along with the more foreigners why question. You know, I strongly support, and the perspective of many international NGOs would be civil society organizations are often the only effective service providers, and in a fragile context especially. And we should not necessarily be in the business of trying to move all services provided by non-state actors onto being government services. I don't think that's true at all. I talked about our Citizen Voice in Action program, our social accountability efforts around the world as a way of helping citizens connect to government service providers, and a kind of different approach to advocacy that looks more like partnering than about calling them out for failure. It's actually starting with that, but it results in partnership. But alongside that, in many of these contexts, NGOs and civil society groups will be providing the most effective services for a long time ahead, and there's no reason why those services should ever be converted to government run. What should happen is that those services should be aligned with national objectives in that sector. And this is where the Busan Agreement often gets, I think, misinterpreted. When Busan, building on the Paris Declaration, elevated country ownership and elevated the alignment of assistance with national strategies for development, it did not necessarily suggest that all assistance ought to be managed by central governments. In fact, not at all. If there are assistance programs delivered by private health clinics in a large part of a fragile state, what we are working toward is enabling better services, building their capacity, and aligning the needs assessment and the delivery of services with what national objectives might exist. If there's a good strategic plan for improving healthcare and frontline health workers' availability where they're needed, civil society ought to be contributing to that goal too, but they ought not be pushed out of the business of providing those effective services. So I agree. I hope that's what you were saying.
I think I have to cut you off there, Randy, because lunch is calling, so maybe we can have offline on the second piece about why.
I got excited about that answer, so I didn't get to my second two.
Sorry.
But don't make the mistake in the name of coordination of doing what we did in Afghanistan and removing effective programs with reforms that weren't ready to be taken off life support at the provincial level, managed by NGOs, and turn them over to the central government as we did in Afghanistan. I think that's going to prove, in the name of coordination and country ownership, I think a major mistake. It will turn out that we have made a major mistake by removing those programs from the management of provincial level reformers.
Great. Thank you. Joe, you have the last word.
Okay. And I know it's going to be a very quick last word. So many great questions. I wish I could respond to all of them, so I'm going to have to pick out just a couple of things. Lynn, the question you had about new threats. I agree. I don't think I'm going to add to your list. Urbanization in fragile states is a key issue that we need to be looking at because what we see, and this happened in the Arab Spring, for example, the venue for instability will be urban environments. And so we need to better understand a couple of things. One, how does urbanization create pressures for political instability? But two, what are the kinds of investments we can make in urban environments to create resilience to some of the forces that can create more violence, especially from criminality. Those are things we need to work on. And that's a little bit of a segue to the second thing that I think is important. The connections between criminalization, criminality, and conflict is one that we really need to better understand, especially in places like Latin America, West Africa, where what we're seeing are places, especially with Latin America, that we traditionally do not think of as being fragile. But to what extent is the violence from criminality eroding the perceptions of legitimacy or effectiveness in those places? That may be something that we really need to pay attention to as we move forward. So maybe I should just end on those 2 points, but I think that those are key pieces of the agenda for people who focus on fragile and conflict-affected countries.
Good. Well, please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. We look forward to many more conversations on this topic.